I'm going to start with you. I'm going to do it. This is experimental. It's like the preemptive strike. I don't know if you remember this. This was language that, I guess for some of you, was from before you were born, around the time of the first Gulf War. There was a lot of talk about something called a preemptive strike, which was that idea that you might, create a military attack in order to prevent a military attack. It was really popular with George W. Bush. Anyway, so what I thought I'd do is see if you guys wanted to ask questions before I gave a talk. See how that works. Anybody have any questions? It's working. Okay, yeah. What's your question?
Yeah, I had a question. We briefly talked about Adam Curtis earlier, and I was thinking about, you had a comment about the most effective and sincere form of activism being, he said this maybe 2 years ago, being to just disappear off social media and go to Syria.
Can everybody hear the question?
So the question was, we had a conversation earlier about Adam Curtis, who is a British documentarian known for his polemical, kind of brilliant ranting documentaries that really trace the modern history of the world. And they're really a lot of fun and really fun to watch. But apparently, Adam Curtis said that the best thing you could do as an activist today is drop out and go to Syria, go fight in Syria. I'm assuming that he was talking about fighting for the Rojava cause. And I think that's about the stupidest thing you could possibly do right now. So I disagree with Adam Curtis.
Next.
In that regard. Yeah, like I don't know if you guys are familiar, there's a revolutionary movement in northern Syria, or in what they're calling Rojava. And it depends on who you talk to about the wisdom of going and fighting there. I mean, they're trying to build a sort of revolutionary, egalitarian society, a kind of new world based on the ideas of Murray Bookchin, loosely sort of a kind of communist or at least socialist world that has more equity. But they're doing it, with guns and weapons in a war zone in an area that has a lot of already contested property. And so going there as an outsider and trying to fight is, it's kind of brilliant. It's like the Spanish Civil War, but it doesn't mean that it's going to turn out well for you. And I just read about a girl I know from the UK who died there yesterday or 2 days ago, fighting for the Rojavan cause. She became an armed revolutionary. I don't know. I don't think it's the easiest, simplest, or best thing you can do. It's certainly a thing you can do if you're really dedicated and really militant. But it comes with a lot of strings attached. I actually met a guy who's a former carny, right? Who grew up trying to convince people to play games at the carnival that they would lose, right? He's basically like on the low levels of like getting people addicted to gambling, but he did it since he was a child. So he became so good at getting people addicted to these carnival games that when he was, a young man and social media was being invented, he became like the expert on how to create addiction in users. And so it's all based on these sort of psychological principles of reward, micro rewards, your likes, whatever you're going to get. And if you actually right now, if you go to try to raise venture capital in Silicon Valley for your new app, you have to prove that it's addictive enough. And these things are easy to prove because you just need enough money to do your study group to see if the addiction rates are high enough for it to sell. In other words, for people to play it enough or use it enough, like, for those of you who are using Instagram or Facebook, it's all about whether you get those likes. So, unfortunately, while you're doing all that, of course, it's also harvesting all your data. And I know you guys know all this, but we're all, I know it and I still do it, and I'm still shocked every day that I ended up working for these massive companies doing data entry on myself. All the time, basically surveilling myself, reporting on what I like, what I don't like, and giving them a full-fledged psychological profile that they can use to sell me shit all the time. The good news is there are other forms of activism that you can do, and I think that they rely on very basic forms of storytelling in the service of social movements. I know a lot of you guys are journalists here, and ultimately social movements for the last couple of hundred years have made many, many big gains. And despite the depressing moments when progress, let's say, in the sense of progressive causes, like the idea of egalitarian societies, and humanist ideas, when progress is rolled back, like at this moment with Trump, regardless of that, if you take a long view, you see success. And the things that are successful are the great, big stories that move ideas forward. And so I think they're about symbolic action. And I think about things like, probably some of the things you'll remember, like you may not have heard of Rojava, but you know about Rosa Parks, right? Rosa Parks sat down in the front of the bus. You see the photo of Rosa Parks. In fact, there we have Rosa Parks on the bus, iconic image, one that, you learn about even in sort of grade school or, middle school now. But there's something about this image that's, who's this guy behind her? Is a white guy, right? I mean, he's had this, the story here is that, she's going to sit down on the front of the bus and break the law, right? But who is this guy really?
He's a journalist.
He's a journalist. This guy is not just kind of a bystander who is there on that particular day. He's actually the journalist who is writing for UPI at the time, United Press International, one of the wire services. And when they went to shoot this photo, they didn't have the right photo. They basically said, we need a white guy to sit here behind her so that it's clear in the photo what story we're telling. We're telling the story of Rosa Parks breaking the law. If we didn't have a white guy sitting behind her on the bus, the story wouldn't work. And they're essentially staging this event, right? It's real, it's not fake, but it is manipulated, it's controlled, it's created, it's a story that they're trying to tell. Also, Rosa Parks, although she's very real, she worked with a team of people, and they all decided collectively that she was the right person to sit on the bus because she was the most sort of endearing, let's say, to a white public, a white, mostly racist public, who at the time would have maybe had a problem if this was a black man sitting up there and would have felt like offended, more offended. But you're like, how could you be offended by Rosa Parks? Well, people still were, right? But the point is that they constructed this photo for that moment. And so this is an example of symbolic action. The other thing about this photo is that this action is that it's prefigurative, right? But in this one image, they get across a whole story about the future they want to see, right? This utopian vision of the future. And so actions like this that tell stories very quickly, very easily, very succinctly, keep moving progress forward for social movements. And I guess I'd say that things like this, I think, are more valuable than going and becoming a soldier in Rojava. Right? There's things that Gandhi did with other people. Gandhi, story is that he wove his own clothes, right? Now, if you are the leader of an independence movement in one of the largest countries in the world that has incredibly divisive social politics, religious politics, and you're trying to hold that whole thing together, do you really have time to weave your own clothes? I mean, seriously. Like, I think the answer is no. But on a symbolic level, the importance of weaving your own clothes and the importance of showing that you are autonomous and that you are exercising your independence from the British state, right? From the colonial government that was taxing clothes, that was selling back to Indians the raw materials in the form of clothes and forcing them basically into subservience through this market-based mechanism. I mean, that is worth talking about. And so that's why he kept pretending, I think. I mean, I'm going to say pretending. He really was doing it. He wasn't. It's not like he wasn't doing it. It's real. It's just like Rosa Parks sitting on the front of the bus. But it's storytelling. It's symbolic action that's meant to teach a lesson. And the other thing to remember with all this stuff is that all of these people doing this are collaborating with journalists, right? They're working with journalists to tell the story. So Gandhi was very careful to have his embedded International Herald Tribune journalists with him all the time. And so whenever they did an action, it was important that the eyes of the world were looking at them. And they did that by making sure there were journalists there who would write the stories that they were telling or that they were creating this symbolic action around.
We wanted to make a political point about an organization that's pulling off some of the world's biggest hoaxes. No, not this organization. The one across the street. The one that looks like a US government office, but really is working against the government. In reality, the US Chamber of Commerce is a large corporation that is reported to lie to the public on behalf of even bigger corporations. They spend nearly $500,000 a day trying to convince the US government to do really stupid shit, like killing environmental regulations and undermining workers' rights. But since they spend so much money on their hoaxes, many people believe them.
And as it says, American Free Enterprise dream big, but their dreams are our nightmares because their plans are to prevent us from passing climate change legislation, which means we're screwed.
Since the Chamber was hoaxing us all and threatening our survival, we decided to fight fire with fire. We would reveal one of their biggest lies by masquerading as them. We would hold a press conference as the Chamber at the National Press Club, but first, we sent out a parody press release from them. It was sort of like their normal ones, except ours was sane. How would the world react to the Chamber suddenly reversing its position on climate change?
In a reversal on climate change from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, it will reverse its position on the climate change bill and wants a carbon tax, if you will. All right, so the U.S. Chamber is denying it now. All right, so maybe not. Apparently it was a hoax. Either there is a group or some people or a person.
Is there any involvement of the White House whatsoever? I couldn't even begin to go there, Larry, on that one.
Today, the country's largest business lobby, the Chamber of Commerce, got punked. It began early this morning when a press release went out, purportedly from the United States Chamber of Commerce. Amazingly, the release said that the Chamber would now support this legislation that it spent months fighting against. Reporters were surprised and probably confused at this odd turn of events, but that was nothing compared to what actually happened at the press conference when it was held later on this morning. Watch this tape.
Clean coal is a technology that has not only not been proven, it basically doesn't exist.
Okay, this is, I'm Eric Wolfschlager. I'm with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. This is not an official U.S. Chamber of Commerce event. So I don't know what pretenses you're here. I know some of you in the press world, but this is a fraudulent press activity and a stunt.
Who are you really, sir?
Do you have a business card? Are you with the U.S. Chamber?
I do. We can discuss afterwards.
Okay. Can I see your business card?
Can I see yours?
Are you here representing the U.S. Chamber of Commerce?
Yes, I am.
Okay, well, I work there, and you do not look familiar to me at all.
Could I see your business card? Could I see your business card?
Yes, I am. This guy does not represent the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Okay? No. This is not an official Chamber of Commerce. This is not, what is your position at the Chamber of Commerce?
I just spoke my position.
No, what is your title, your official title with the U.S. Chamber?
I'm the assistant to Mr. Donahue.
Okay. This guy is a fraud, he's lying. This is, a stunt that I've never seen before. So if you'd like to actually talk to the legitimate Chamber of Commerce, I've got my business cards outside. This gentleman, I will assure you, does not have any business cards, and he's not legitimate.
Show me your business card. No, show me yours. No, show me yours.
What? It's just, I mean, it's so weird.
The U.S. Chamber of Commerce says it was victimized.
Victims of a hoax by environmental activists.
Is that public relations hoaxes undermine the genuine effort to find solutions on the challenge of climate change?
A hoax actually led to the chamber admitting that there is a challenge for climate change. It seems like a good first step. So next up, hoax is about poverty, violence,
Education.
Education.
The big education hoax. We've got a big education hoax in this
country. The hoax is a
country.
good first step.
Yeah.
So that's the story, folks. Not entirely. Then they decided to use this opportunity to raise funds. They put out Google ads. You click on that, and it would take you to a page from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce asking you to give them $250 to help defend themselves against us. It gets even funnier. They not only use this opportunity to fundraise, but then they decided to sue us. And by the way, we're being defended by some of the best lawyers in the world. We're being defended by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Go to EFF.org to check them out. Just wait, there's another punchline. Not only did Fox pick up our release, not only did Volkswagen come and interrupt our press conference, not only did the Chamber of Commerce try to raise funds off this event, and not only did they sue us, but they actually changed their policy 2 weeks later.
Just today, the Chamber of Commerce changed positions, not courtesy of the yes men with that sign in Washington a few weeks ago, but they're now saying, surprisingly to me, and I'm glad about it, that they want to get legislation, and they're now working with the sponsors of the bill.
The goal there was to serve the climate movement. That was trying to force, groups like the Chamber of Commerce to change their position on climate change. And really, it was also that entire campaign, which was putting pressure on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, was trying to get people to know what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce really was. Because, like I said in the beginning of this video, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce were a bunch of imposters. They make you think that they're part of the U.S. government. They have a giant building right across from the White House in Washington, D.C., but really they're mostly an oil and gas lobby, also other industries, and they use all these other little businesses that were members as a way of legitimizing lobbying against the state, in other words, against the public. What they do is try to undermine labor laws, undermine environmental laws, attack the public sector, in other words, attack you. So anyway, yeah.
Why did they change their position?
They changed their position because it became untenable. What happened is large institutional members of the organization started leaving. And when like groups like P&G, Pacific Gas and Electric, Nike, companies that, especially companies from the Northwest, places where the public really was in favor of climate legislation, companies that were located there started to, and felt some brand exposure especially, started to leave because they realized that it was no longer, they'd been targeted by activists in a multi-year campaign, and it was starting to basically get through. And they could no longer be affiliated with this organization when they realized they had so much brand exposure, so much risk. So a company like Nike, a lot of people who buy Nikes don't want to be affiliated with, they don't want their clothes to advertise that they have a major climate destroyer, as part of their branding. So that was what happened. The company started to leave, and then and then a whole bunch of other things happened. Like this was just a tiny little part of all kinds of actions that were happening to try to bring attention to what they were doing and their role in blocking climate policy. There's two modes that we've operated in. One is to take on the guise of these companies or entities like the Chamber of Commerce and announce something satirical that's already in keeping with their current policies. So something that, it's like Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which is maybe the most famous example of satire that we have in European culture. And that's where he published a pamphlet where he said that the Irish could solve their hunger problem by eating their own babies. And this this idea, which some people initially kind of took a little bit seriously, because the pamphlet was initially published without it being clear that the authors weren't let's say state actors. I mean, the story at that time, just like many of the contemporary famines, that the story that you don't often read about is that there was enough food in Ireland to feed the Irish. It's just that it was being exported. There wasn't enough money that the Irish had to pay for the food that was exporting, the grains that were being sent abroad. So there were ships full of food leaving Ireland during the famines, and it was like a colonialist starving out of the Irish that was happening. And so that Modest Proposal was meant to kind of like be a very sort of dark approach, but comic, but dark approach to the problem that would sort of get people talking about it, create buzz. So we used to work that way more. We did a lot of these things where I could show an example, but there's that, and then there's this using this sort of rip in the fabric, like using our authority that we had as the Chamber of Commerce to announce a utopian solution. And I think to some degree, even as fake news, that still kind of works. Because the utopian idea is one that needs to be circulated and often isn't circulated enough. So if you can use a sort of like a ruse to simply get that idea into the air, into the ether for a little while, I think it's still worth it. There is actually one big distinction that we have between what we do with our fake news and what I would say the advertising industry, the PR people have done for certainly at least a century, if not hundreds of years, with their fake news, right? There is lies that are revealed, and then there's lies that are meant to continue to fool the public. With us, we always reveal our lie immediately after the story breaks, right? So like something like this, the US Chamber of Commerce, as soon as that Fox guy announces that the US Chamber of Commerce has changed their position, we're like, great, we can send out our reveal press release. So the mechanics of this are that we start out with a press strategy where we will announce that, we're announcing that the US Chamber of Commerce has changed its position. As soon as somebody picks it up and we know that it's newsworthy because of that, we announce that that it's fake. And we explain our motives for it. So the idea is that most of the journalists who are covering it would cover the whole story. And the whole story means that there's a net gain of information, and we're very careful about our facts and our fact checking when we come out with the reveal release, because we can't afford to fuck that up. Because we've started the process with fake news, we're following it with real news, right? Or real information. It may not be news, it's only news because we created this fake thing to start out with. And the reason we have so much pickup in so many of these projects is because there's a lot of journalists who've been trying to get their editors to cover this story for a long time. They want to write a story, they know the story really well, and they just don't have an excuse to tell it at any given moment. So like everybody, there are tons of journalists who are totally pissed off at the Chamber of Commerce. They feel like they're lied to every day, and yet they're supposed to, because we have these weird ideas about journalism and balance and all this bullshit. They feel they're obligated by often the editorial policy of the newspaper to give them a voice, even though, it's kind of bullshit. You know that those guys are assholes who are destroying the planet, and you're still obligated to quote them, right? Like what, this is like writing a history of World War II and making sure that you get enough of Hitler's quotes in there and give them equal time. Like seriously, it's like it is completely insane, but it is the way we do journalism in the United States. It's not the way we do it all over the world. There's different places do it differently, but this is one of those things that that a lot of journalists feel kind of, in my experience anyway, working with them, they feel a little bit straitjacketed when they get out and they want to do really good things. Let's face it, you're not becoming a journalist to get rich. You're becoming a journalist because you feel like you want to do something good. Most of the time, 95% of the journalists we've met are doing it because they want to do something for humanity. They want to do something for the environment. They want to do something important, and it's a really important role. We're in a democracy. Democracies can't work without an informed citizenry. You can't have an informed citizenry without journalism, at least not in modern society. Unfortunately, that's where it all breaks down with social media. And this is what's been happening now in the last few years, is that, and this is why our methods aren't working too, is that we used to work with a professional class of journalists. And that was really the way our stories got told well, right? People like you went to school, trained, went out and were working and were being paid by a newspaper or a magazine to do good reporting. And now what happens is the fake news is given equal weight. Like, our fake story might be the only thing that anybody sees. They may never see the reveal news release that we send out, because we used to work with news releases, right? And so with social media, there's no filter there. And in fact, the weight is determined by algorithms, and the algorithms are dependent on what you've been looking at, what you want. They're giving you what you want. And actually giving you what you want is entirely what we use anyway, what we've used for years, to get into these contexts and to get access to these meetings. And so you realize that psychology of desire, right? That psychology of getting fulfillment for whatever profile you've set up is so powerful for manipulating you or for being able to kind of do anything you want with that person. I mean, those kinds of things. Weirdly, by being a total con man for many years, I've become intimately familiar with that kind of psychological manipulation that happens. And so when you're on the receiving end of it now with social media, and there is no filter, you may only see the fake news, you may never see the reveal, and that's why we've also really shifted what we're doing, and we realize that, well, we can't really do the satirical thing very effectively, because if we do the satirical thing and it gets out as the primary story, the people who see that are going to be a different segment of the population than those who see the reveal, right? It's going to be people who want to believe that fake story that see it. This idea that if we're going to do a prank, like these sort of prank type things, if we lead with something utopian, then there's no real downside. It's like if people believe the lie, the lie is still it's still a net gain in a way. But we also do things where we don't have to lie. So one of the examples of this is, let's say I was here and I was introduced as somebody from ExxonMobil to you guys, right? And I came in, I'd be wearing a business suit, and I would announce that ExxonMobil has decided that we're going to stop exploiting fossil fuels because we've finally realized that, that we can't do this. It's just it doesn't work for us. And we're reinvesting in green energy, and by 2025, we're going to stop all the, oil refineries we've got going. And, it's going to be a big loss, and people are going to suffer. I mean, people in our company are going to suffer, but the net gain will be, a future for humanity and for a lot of the species that are currently going extinct. You would probably feel pretty good about that, I would think. I once made an announcement like this at a college graduation, actually. I was the commencement speaker at my alma mater, Reed College. And just before, so I went on, what I did, I worked with the Fossil Free Reed group, which was the, and working together, we cooked up this commencement speech, which is also a little unusual. I worked with the students on my commencement speech. And I announced that they were actually, just before the commencement ceremony, I met with the Board of Trustees over breakfast, and they were sitting right behind me, right? The Board of Trustees and the President, and they had committed to divesting the endowment of the school from fossil fuels, right? And my whole talk before that had been about the crisis that we face, this massive climate crisis. And so everybody jumped up and threw their caps in the air and screamed, and, and it was fake. But what that moment was for, that moment wasn't really, and we didn't send out a press release at that moment saying, this happened. What we did is we just had that incident happen in the room. But then we told the story of what happened in the room, because that was the story. So we weren't faking out a journalist in that case. What we were doing is, immediately afterward, the president of the university had to get up and say, well, actually, it's not true.
Well, also the board can feel the enthusiasm of the students. Isn't that your audience in that case?
Well, I think the audience in that case was still an external audience. We still put a video out afterward. And so the audience is partly the people in the room, it's partly the Board of Trustees, but really it's about taking that moment and saying to the rest of the world, this is what it feels like when this reality is achieved, or when we believe we've gotten to this point, right? And so there's like a third party that's the audience, but we didn't have to fool a journalist, and so the story comes out simply as the smaller audience was fooled. It's not. And somebody has to be fooled for people to really enjoy the prank, right? So if it's based on a prank, somebody has to be fooled, but they don't have to be fooled. The journalist doesn't have to be fooled. Mm-hmm. And that means that there's the misinformation part of it doesn't circulate on social media. Mm-hmm. It was a really funny, weird event, by the way, because the students loved it. Quite a few of the parents loved it. Board of Trustees, not so much. Communications director for the school loved it because he was a former communications director for the Sierra Club, and so he was really happy about it. But then the weirdest part of it is that I had all these parents, angry parents, who came up to me afterward. Not all these, but maybe half a dozen, and they were angry for one reason. It's because, and I was so shocked about this. They're angry because I dissed Steve Jobs.
Oh, you're kidding?
No, I mean it was really weird because the speech was basically, Steve Jobs was a Reed dropout. He had gone to Reed College, he dropped out, founded Apple. He's the most famous Reed non-graduate. But it turns out that there are people are religious about Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs hadn't given a commencement speech at Reed. He gave one at Stanford, of course. And at Stanford, his famous commencement speech was "Do what you love." That was his speech, and it was all about how you have to find that thing that you love and do it. And I was saying, and my speech was that no, the shit has hit the fan. And Steve Jobs said that 10 years ago, but now we are living in the Anthropocene, and you have to do what you must. And if you love it, that's awesome. But if you don't love it and you're good at it and it's making a difference, you gotta fucking do it. Because the biggest risk that we face is not doing anything. And if you're just doing what you love and it isn't contributing to changing things, then we're all fucked. And so I didn't use quite that language in the commencement speech because it seems unnecessarily gratuitous. But, and I had written it down, so I kind of could censor myself a little bit. But it turned out that the parents who came up were gravely offended by me telling their kids not to do what they love. But if we look at history and we look at our heroes in history, they're not always doing what they love. Sometimes they are. But I think if if you'd ask a lot of the people who are in the and we have actually talked to people who are major players in the civil rights movement, you know, did you love doing it? Well, no, because, and what they often say is no, because it never felt like we were winning, right? It's like a series of great big losses that eventually end up in a net gain, a net win, right? But it's the type of thing where they call it struggle for a reason, you know? And so it's not always that fun, but it can be fun. And that's like we found with the Yes Men, we do these things that are mischievous and fun because of it.
Welcome to Go Expo's keynote luncheon. Please welcome SK Wolf.
First, I need to say how wonderful it is to see on all the faces here today the childlike exuberance of a great industry in full flower. And why not? Without oil, at least 4 billion people would starve, and starving would become the new black. But I'm not here today to pat us all on the back. I'm here to speak of Plan Bs. As Andy began outlining Exxon's tough solution to climate change, 10 volunteers passed out 300 human flesh candles. This vigil would be like no other. Who first had the idea to use the oil of a recently living animal to light his or her house? Even today, Shetland Islanders cut the heads off their puffins and put wicks in the stumps to make candles. We at Exxon firmly believe that a free market will, if left to its own devices, always find solutions to the dilemmas that humanity faces. We're calling our new technology Vivolium. As Andy began to describe Exxon's new biofuel, the candles were lit. A strange odor rose into the air.
They had a lot of human
What you
hair
see here is an artist's rendition of an advanced, large-scale plan. The Vivolium feedstock is renewable and unprecious, and it responds to the need of a shrinking market with greater supply. The dance of capital appears in full flower. Finally, it was time to introduce Reggie Watts, the dying Exxon janitor who had volunteered to be turned into fuel. And now, we begin the tribute video to Reggie Watts.
Worked in maintenance for a while. Moved up to maintenance 2, started doing cleanup, toxic spill cleanup.
After I heard from the doctor that I was going to die, I felt like I had something to live for.
I think I'd like to be a candle. There's just so many uses for a candle. I mean, you know, like if you want something romantic, like that'd be nice to know I was a candle on the table. You know, people when they first met each other on a date. I think that would be great. I'd love that. I mean,
This is extraordinary observance. I mean, this guy died.
Switch this off before
This man died.
it's people. Really is.
Thank you very much, Sheldon. Thank you very much.
I'm very sorry, but we've been cut off. Apparently, we're not allowed to have a funerary observance for a man who's died to make a product possible. And are you allowed to do that to me? Employee, and these are actually 30 or 40% from his actual 80%, I'm sorry.
The remaining 20 is from what?
The remaining 20 is just, you know, bonders to keep it together. We have to think in such a
What are your credentials with ExxonMobil, please?
Sorry.
What part of the body?
What industry you guys on there to
Yeah, thank you.
Hey.
Shut it down.
All right. So actually, the only reason that they don't take us off stage because they knew what we were saying was fake. It was somebody in the audience actually recognized us from the earlier movie being on television. And so that's how we were made in this case. They then texted the conference organizers, and we knew that because, we only knew that later, because at the time we thought that we had really pushed it to the extreme and that the conference organizers were so offended by this idea of turning people into biofuel and actually handing him out. I mean, they were like a little effigy of Reggie, you know? And now Reggie's super famous, you know, he's like band leader on James Corden's show, Late Late Show. But at the time he was like, you know, he was only famous in small circles. So he was still famous, but, you know, it was not really, they didn't recognize him. They just recognized this weird one person in the audience. And we had these volunteers at the tables who, and in the edit room, we saw that this woman was like, oh my God, I've seen that guy on Showtime. I've seen him on Showtime. And she texted the organizers, and then as soon as she did, she said, oh, damn it. You know, I wanted to see the end of this. And she thought that she actually thought that she wasn't going to get to see the end of it, but she did, because at that point, the conference organizers, we had cameras all around the room, and so the conference organizers started to try to figure out what to do. And the first thing they did is they went to the security. Well, the security is they're the Stampede ground security. The Calgary Stampede is the largest rodeo in the world. Right, and that's the primary tenant of this giant venue. And so when they have a business conference, the Stampede ground security, who are these big old cowboys with mustaches and big hats, are like, well, where's the drunk people you want us to take out, you know? And they're like, it's the guys on stage. And they're like, no, you know, they're the guys on stage and they're having a candlelight vigil and we can't do that. You know, which guy in a suit am I supposed to believe? And so eventually the conference organizer himself is the one who comes up there, and he was like this tall too. He was like really big. And he came up, he's a huge British guy, and he's the one who kind of carries me off as a kind of protest, and leaves Jacques there to continue to talk to the press. This was also one of these moments where we discovered that, you know, when you're wearing a suit, when you're in that context, all the risks that you assume that you might be taking, or that your friends tell you that you're taking, or even that lawyers tell you you're taking, you're not. That there's like no risk. I mean, we discovered in this case, when they called the police on us and said, you're really in trouble, you've broken some laws, the police came, and you know, they'd locked us in a little room, and the police came in the room, and they acted really serious, and then they're like, as soon as they're in the room and the doors closed, they're like, what are you guys doing? And so we told them, I mean, up till then we'd stayed in character. We're like, we're from ExxonMobil, we're from the US government. And then the police, you know, they were the real police, so we're like, well, you know, we're comedians, we call ourselves comedians, and we're doing this thing, we're pretending to be from ExxonMobil. And they said, gee guys, that's really funny. But why are these guys so angry? And so then they went out, they were being very Canadian and friendly. And they went out and talked to them for a while. They came back to us and they were like, oh, they're really angry. We're going to have to like do something. We're going to have to write you a ticket. And when we go out there, pretend to be really sad, okay? Like come out to the car and we'll put you in the car and we'll drive you home. So, and then they wrote us a ticket. And when they gave us the ticket, they were like, afterward in the car, they said, you know, don't worry about this. Like, we're not going to show up in court. The judge will dismiss this. This is a trespassing ticket, but you know, you're invited to speak here, you know. And then they started talking to us about the local politics that went with the oil boom in Calgary. And the cops were pissed because they understood why we were doing it. They were quite sophisticated about it. Crime had gone up, homelessness, massive amounts of homelessness because of the boom. You know, and if the cop wanted to have a beer after work that used to cost them $5, it cost almost $15 for a beer at that moment. In Canadian dollars, which at that time were 1.3 to the dollar. They were like almost, you know, 1.5 times the value of a dollar. Now for a Canadian dollar, that was a lot because they've been 90 cents on the dollar for a long time. So basically people like cops who are on, you know, civic salaries could no longer afford to live in Calgary, and their jobs are a whole lot harder, and they had all this migrant labor, mostly, you know, men who are committing acts of violence after work because, they were making tons of money and they're blowing tons of money and getting really drunk. And so they were just like, this is ruining our city. Like the petroleum industry is ruining our town. And that's weird for a petroleum town, right? And so, so anyway, that was like a really interesting learning experience because, you know, your allies are not always who you think they'll be. And in this case, like in every case where we've been in a situation like this, the cops have actually, when, you know, they haven't been our friends, but they've not really exactly been our enemies either, not naturally anyway. In other cases, though, they are. Like, they do arrest you for things. We got sued by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The EFF represented us. The U.S. Chamber was suing us based on trademark law, and their case was really kind of bullshitty. You know, like, the idea was that we used their recognized brand, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They said to make money because we're making a film, right? So their angle was they're using the law that they would normally use to like protect, like against rip-off Nike sneakers being sold on the street in Brooklyn, and they're applying it to political speech. That was what the argument that our lawyers made, was that they were not, you know, using that law properly. And our lawyers didn't even have to win because after 4.5 years, the chamber withdrew the case just before it went to trial. And I think that's the thing, is the chamber thought that we would flinch. They thought that we would cut a deal. They thought that they could declare victory. They thought that they would force us, and this is the way the law generally works, is whoever has more muscle or is willing to like bluff harder, which is usually the person who has more muscle and more money, and they have kind of endless pockets, endless deep pockets. So they thought that they could make us kind of go away and then declare a victory, but it didn't happen because we had backup from the EFF, and so eventually, you know, we won. The sort of assault on free speech, you know, rules isn't surprising because the U.S. has some of the best laws in the world in this regard, and I'm sure that, you know, it's in the interest of a lot of people with money to erode them. We've gotten many dozens of letters from companies, and they're with the exception of the Chamber of Commerce, which never wrote a letter. They never gave us a cease and desist letter. They just sued us straight out. But we've gotten many cease and desist letters. But it's important. Like the first 5 or so, we thought, wow, this is exciting. We might get sued. And we usually publish the cease and desist letter that's sent on our website and send out a press release saying we're under attack by, you know, whoever, Dow Chemical. And then we had the elements of the story, because you need your antagonist and your protagonist to really have a good full story. And so they usually say some really outrageous things in those letters. They sound really threatening. But you know, the funny part about it is that those letters are also something that they're required to send out. So like if they perceive that you're threatening them in some way, if you use their logo, if you impersonate them, they're required by trademark law to defend their trademark. And that means that if they're a big enough company and they have a legal department, the legal department jumps into action. Why? Because that's how they get paid, right? The idea is to do more work. If you're a lawyer, you know, you want something to, you want to uphold the law, even if it's kind of bullshit, because you get paid to do it. So there's entire legal departments of companies that spend all their time just churning out these kind of form letters that they're required to send out by law. Otherwise, they could, in theory, lose their trademark for not defending it. In practice, they wouldn't. And in practice, they would probably fire half the lawyers and it wouldn't be a problem. But since we live in economies of fear, I think we live in economies of fear. And the bigger the corporation and the more risk you could assume that you have, the more exposure you could assume that you have. You're exposed at the scale of your wealth, right? That's what you lose. Because in these cases too, like when we do this kind of thing, when we, let's say, you know, impersonate the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, we're not breaking a law. We're engaged in political speech. There's no criminal statute that says that we're doing anything wrong. Not in this country, right? So the only thing that we could be subject to is a civil case, a civil suit. And anybody can bring a civil suit against anybody else for any reason, really. Like, you don't need to have a reason. You can bring a suit against anyone. So it's kind of, you know, it ends up being this weird thing. If you have nothing to lose, then why not get sued? It's actually a great tactic for talking about your issue, right? So we were always hoping to get sued. That's another thing that, you know, we learned from other activists who had gotten sued. Very famous case in the UK called McLibel, where these two activists had been sued by McDonald's and used it as a massive platform to talk about what was wrong with McDonald's. And instead of, they were sued for handing out pamphlets on the street corner outside McDonald's in London. And so instead of handing out 100 pamphlets a day and talking to a few people, suddenly they were talking to first, you know, millions of people through the UK press, and eventually billions of people through the global press, because that story became so big that McDonald's was suing these two activists who decided to defend themselves in court, right? And this case went on for 5 years. It was the longest running libel suit in British court history. But there was essentially no risk to them. The only risk was financial. They could have lost what they didn't have, which was money, right? So if you happen to be super rich, I don't recommend doing this tactic, because you should use your money, you should give it to people who can, just to keep them going while they're using that tactic, right? I mean, there are sort of decisions to be made. It's not like there is, but you're only exposed at least in this legal system for civil suits if you have money. And if you don't, who cares? So when I was in college, I was into this sort of mischief thing, and there were a lot of political issues that were happening sort of in Portland. And me and a couple of other people started doing these sort of performances, and one of them was changing the street signs in downtown Portland. There was a controversy over renaming a street after Martin Luther King Jr. And the citizens group formed and was successfully repealing the commemorative naming. And so we went and did this guerrilla action where we renamed the street Malcolm X Street. We changed every street sign, every highway directional, hundreds of signs. We had people involved who were climbers, you know, they were hardcore climbing up buildings. We did all the signs, and in the morning we put out a statement that that said that basically this shady, kind of secret group called Group X had changed the street signs to, make a comment on what it was like for this really crazy right-wing white supremacist group that was taking back the name of Malcolm X Street. Anyway, long and the short of it is, it was an easy way, it turned out to be an easy way to speak at a volume that was way louder than we would have otherwise. We were just a bunch of college students. It turned out that if we did these things, we could make comments using the news and as an amplifier, and that felt really exciting and really powerful. And so then I started getting into this kind of field, and I realized that I could call it out, and that it was accepted in that context. And that's where I found that it had this sort of nutritive, place where I could grow that sort of practice, which then I discovered had been going on forever. That was the thing, is I was just doing it intuitively, but after a while I realized, oh, there's this whole history of creative activism that I can tap into, and there's a context for it, and I can understand what I'm doing. And then I can do it much smarter too. Then I could actually say, okay, if I'm doing this, I got to work with these activist organizations to figure out how our messaging fits with it, and to make it, more targeted.